Whoa! I think my engine just quit. Let's talk about engine failures. Now, aircraft are machines and they can fail. It's not very likely, but it is a possibility, and we have to be trained to deal with the situation. Now, all courses of pilot training will include engine failure practice. Now, it's a simulated environment, but we practice engine failures after takeoff and engine failures in flight. Let's talk about some ways that an engine can fail. Now, it's a common misconception that people will just assume that an engine will just go bang and fail, but this isn't always the case. So it really depends on the type of failure. If it's something to do with the propeller and your propeller falls off, obviously it's not the engine that's failed, but you're not going to develop power, so we're going to treat it the same or similar to an engine failure. There's also things that might be due to poor planning, like fuel exhaustion or even fuel starvation. It could even be a bird strike that you have that's going to cause your engine to fail. And the way we deal with these situations can vary, but there's a few common things that we're going to do regardless of the type of engine failure. The first thing that's going to happen when you have an engine failure, you're probably going to go into a little bit of shock. But if you've been trained correctly, you're going to use this stress and you're going to channel it to perform your actions correctly. After we've composed ourselves, what we're going to do is we're going to trim for the glide attitude. This is going to then correlate to our best glide speed. After we've got our glide attitude and our glide speed, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go through our initial action checks. Now, this isn't a checklist that we get out from the checklist in the aircraft. These are things that we should have committed to memory so we can perform them quickly as soon as the failure occurs. Our initial action checklist will be something like this, but it's going to depend on your school and the aircraft you're flying. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to bring our throttle almost to idle. We're going to ensure the mixture is full rich. We're going to ensure that the fuel shutoff is all the way in and the fuel selector is on both. We're then going to ensure the fuel pump's on and our mags are on both. Why are we doing these things? Well, we don't want to have the throttle at full throttle because if the engine does come back alive, it's going to give us a bit of a nasty shock. And we want our mixture to be full rich to make sure that we are providing enough fuel to the engine. The fuel shutoff should be in because if we have the fuel shutoff out, it's going to completely shut off the fuel supply to the engine. No fuel, no power. Cool, so we're going to ensure that the fuel selector is on both. We want to make sure that we're drawing fuel from both tanks. If you've been running on either left or right, it could be possible that the fuel has run out of the tank that you've selected, or there is a blockage in the line from that tank. Next thing, we're going to ensure that the auxiliary or electric fuel pump is on. Most engines will have an engine-driven fuel pump. If this were to fail, we can use the electric or the auxiliary fuel pump to try and pump fuel into the engine. Mags on both, we want to make sure that we're getting as much of a spark as we can from the magnetos. It could be that one side has died, so we want to make sure that they're on both to give us a spark to the engine. All right, once you've done that, you want to assess if the engine is restarted. Great, probably best to now find a suitable place to land, either an airstrip or trying to return home. You probably don't want to be in the air for too long in case it happens again. So once we've performed these initial action checks, we're going to see if the engine has got power again. Now, if it's something quite simple as, I don't know, maybe a passage without you looking has for some reason decided to cut the mixture, well then we probably know that the engine is going to be okay. But it might be something a little bit more sinister. So if it does restart, it's probably not best to spend too much time in the air. We probably want to get back on the ground in case it does happen again. Also, after completing our initial action checks, engine hasn't started, let's dive in a little bit more deep and go through our troubleshoot checks. The first thing that we're going to check is our fuel selector. Now, it's possible in some older aircraft that maybe your fuel selector wasn't in the correct position. Maybe the mechanism is showing that it's on both, but underneath it isn't actually selected to both. So what we're going to do, we're going to change it to the left tank, to the right tank, and then back to both. If this doesn't solve the issue, we're then going to ensure that the fuel pump is on, and we're going to check the mag. So we're going to cycle through left, right, both, and then if the propeller isn't windmilling, so if the propeller isn't spinning naturally in the air, we're actually going to crank that engine. The last thing we can do, we can try some varying techniques of changing the mixture and the throttle and trying to restart the engine at varying power settings. It could be that the engine is maybe getting too much fuel or again, not enough. So remember, aviate, navigate, communicate. We've aviated the aircraft. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to navigate. Now remember, your aircraft isn't a brick. It is going to glide, and it's going to glide pretty well depending on how much height that you have. Also remember, when we're picking our fuel, go through your fuel selection process. Last thing we're going to do after we've navigated, we are going to communicate. We're going to talk to air traffic control. We're going to give them a mayday call. We're going to let them know the situation, how many people are on board, where we're landing, so they can give us help when we get on the ground. Adelaide Centre, mayday, 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 Lima Charlie Yankee, Lima Charlie Yankee, Lima Charlie Yankee. We've suffered an engine failure to POB, approximately 2 miles south of Dublin. We'll be landing in a field and we'll contact you when we're on the ground. Last thing we have to do is land the aircraft. Now, it depends on where you're flying and what fields you have available to you. Don't forget, you have things like highways which you can land on as well, or unprepared strips, or in a field if you have to. Regardless of where you're landing, whether it be in a field, in an airport, airstrip, or even a highway, you want to pick a location that has the least amount of obstacles possible. Let's face it, if you've had the engine failure, you've had a pretty bad day and a pretty bad flight, any landing you can walk away from is probably a win. So there we go, that's a very brief overview of engine failures. It doesn't always have to be a deadly scenario. As long as you follow your proper training, you can always have a good outcome. To learn these skills and more to become a safe and competent pilot, Adelaide Aviation is the place to be. Visit www.adelaideaviation.com.au.